Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to caffeinate if that's your thing. We are actually going to go right into a video address by U.S. Representative Dina Titus. And we asked Representative Titus because she has been a leader in promoting the inclusion of LGBTIQ people in U.S. foreign policy. Of course, she has led on many other things, immigration reform, environmental protection, economic development, and so on. And before entering Congress, Titus was a professor of political science at the University of Nevada and also served in the Nevada State Senate for over 20 years. So we're going to watch the video, and then my colleagues Neela and Alberto and I are going to have a little discussion about it. So.
Good afternoon. I'm Dina Titus, and I'm proud to represent Nevada's 1st District in Congress. I want to thank Outright International for your kind invitation to address the 10th annual OutSummit. While I'm sorry I'm unable to join you in person, I really appreciate this opportunity to join you virtually. Let me start by saying thank you to all of you for the important work you do. From community leaders to advocates, NGO representatives to academics, and everybody in between, your voices are essential to protecting the rights of the global LGBTQI community while advancing all human rights around the world. The integral discussions you're having at today's summit are quite timely. Tomorrow we mark Human Rights Day, the 76th anniversary of one of the world's most groundbreaking global pledges, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This landmark document, approved by the UN General Assembly in 1948, enshrines the inalienable rights that everyone is entitled to as a human being, regardless of their race, color, religion, sex, language, political persuasion, national and social origin, or any other protected status. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a key framework for international, national, and local laws and policies. It's the foundation of who we are as a democratic society that values justice, peace, and equality. Human rights are universal, they're indivisible, and they're interdependent. Unfortunately, we've seen these ideals erode around the world and unjustly target the global LGBTQI community. From Uganda to Myanmar, at least 67 countries have national laws now criminalizing same-sex relations and forms of gender expression. In addition, there are a myriad of cases of harassment of individuals who identify as part of the LGBTQI community. Arbitrary arrest, harassment, loss of employment, evictions, and homelessness have been documented even in places where no anti-LGBTQI laws are on the books. The call for fundamental human rights to be honored and protected has been a central element of U.S. foreign policy for much of the last century. Our leadership in this area has contributed to other national security goals. These include peace, stability, good governance, counterterrorism, and shared prosperity. While we've made tangible progress in protecting marginalized communities abroad, such as supporting women and girls in Afghanistan, protecting journalistic freedoms in Eastern Europe, and working to end the persecution of Uyghurs in China, we must recommit ourselves to ensuring LGBTQI people everywhere are free to live their lives. One tangible way the U.S. has worked to reassert our global leadership in this regard is by establishing the position of Special Envoy for the human rights of LGBTQI persons within the State Department. First established in 2015, the Special Envoy immediately made a tangible impact. Traveling to 42 countries in just 2 years, Ambassador Randy Berry worked to prevent persecution, push back against proposed discriminatory laws, and hold human rights violators accountable. Then, for 4 years, that position sat vacant until President Biden came along and swiftly appointed Jessica Stern to serve as the State Department's lead to advance LGBTQI rights abroad. I've been thankful to work with Special Envoy Stern and her team throughout her time in office. She's just been a fantastic partner to us in Congress and a true champion of this cause. Now, as we're on the verge of another Trump administration, however, we cannot afford a return to years of divestment, from and disinterest in advancing our human rights objectives. The stakes are just too high for us to pull back now. That's why I've led the effort in Congress to codify various tools aimed at promoting LGBTI fairness and equality, and making Special Envoy Stern and President Biden's work on this issue a key pillar of our foreign policy. My GLOBE Act builds on the laudable accomplishments of so many policymakers and advocates, many of whom are in this room. My bill establishes a broad set of directives, cementing our leadership in the protection and promotion of the rights of LGBT individuals around the world. The GLOBE Act endorses sanctions to punish those responsible for egregious murders and abuses directed at LGBTQI populations. It ensures our foreign assistance, global health programs, and implementing partners are inclusive of LGBTI populations. It directs programming to effectively reach the most at-risk populations and makes decriminalization of LGBTQI status, conduct, or expression a goal in our rule of law programs. The bill also ensures fair access to asylum and refugee programs for LGBTQI persons who face persecution because of their orientation or identity, and it protects LGBTQI persons in immigration detention. Finally, the bill calls for active U.S. leadership and multilateral consideration of these issues. Many elements of this bill now have been implemented unilaterally by the Biden administration, but they risk being undone come January the 20th. Recently, we also commemorated Trans Day of Remembrance and marked a grim milestone. In the past year, 350 transgender people have been murdered. Since 2008, 5,000 cases of anti-trans murders have been recorded. This rise in violence towards the LGBTQI community coincides with the rise in global authoritarianism. If you want to truly lead on protecting human rights, we must also work with our allies to protect democracy in backsliding countries. For example, there's been an authoritarian lean to the Georgian government in the past year. The Georgian Dream Party has cracked down on the free press, sought to oust pro-democracy organizations, and, as demonstrated in the recent election, cozied up to Putin. This all comes as the Georgian parliament signed into law a bill that severely curtails LGBTQI rights in the country and mirrors legislation that had been adopted in Russia. This playbook is being seen in other countries as well, like Egypt, Libya, Uzbekistan, and Burma, just to name several. As the fight to protect LGBTQI communities around the world faces strong headwinds over the next 4 years, the best way to preserve our human rights agenda is to advance good democratic governance around the world. Diverse, equitable democracies are not only more responsive to the wishes of the people, but they are better at protecting marginalized communities and abiding by the rule of law. As the ranking member of the House Democracy Partnership, I've been and will continue to be a leading advocate for preserving global democracy and protecting human rights. Now, I recognize that democracy is not a panacea for hate, but it is a good first step to root out prejudices and injustices. And it must be our best chance to contain the gains that authoritarians and bigots are trying to make. We must live up to the promises our predecessors made upon the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and work together for a more equitable, tolerant, and just society. Please always count on me as an ally in this important fight, and if I can ever be of service, do not hesitate to call. Thank you so much for all you do.
Why don't we take... Well, thank you, Representative Titus, for sending that video address. And now we're going to take the opportunity to discuss it. And Neela, I'm going to let you moderate.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. When we invited Representative Titus to speak at OutSummit, we didn't yet know what the outcome of the elections would be. And so our initial request to her was to be able to respond to whatever the results were of the election and to speak to the future of US LGBTIQ foreign policy. So as we know, since then, there have been developments. And we were unable to have Representative Titus with us today, but I wanted to discuss her remarks with Maria, and who you all know, and with Alberto de Belaunde, who is our co-director of our Queer Legal Futures program based in Peru and a former legislator in Peru who has worked in some challenging political circumstances as well. And so we're just going to have a very brief discussion of these remarks and kind of our outlook on US foreign policy and LGBTIQ human rights going forward. So to start with you, Alberto, Representative Titus ties her remarks to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to the Human Rights Framework. In light of the US election results and the fact that we are going into a US government that probably doesn't believe much in many human rights in the Universal Declaration, or is very selective in the ones that they might choose to enforce, does a human rights approach to LGBTIQ equality still make sense? Is it what we should be prioritizing as a movement? And should we insist on the US being held accountable to international human rights? Or are there other approaches that we should be looking at that might resonate more at this moment?
Okay, thank you for the question. I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to have some kind of bias when I answer. But for me, the human rights framework is fundamental. It has always been the cornerstone of all the international advocacy work we have been done and all the successes we had around the world as a global LGBTIQ movement. And I think that it's really important to understand the danger that we are living in a world where some common sense ideas like human rights are universal, the danger that these ideas are no longer that common sense. So I think that, sure, we could try different approaches, or we can be strategic and try to find different allies to be the champions we need for the next 4 years. But also, we cannot resign to this idea and this energy that we need to put to say that, hey, we are not willing to let the human rights agenda and common sense being thrown out of the window. I think that if we not fight to make it clear that we are not going to accept some going backwards, then that common sense is going to start changing. And it's going to be difficult in 4 years, or if we have other administrations in the future, to try to install again the idea that a democracy, a true democracy, needs to not only play through this human rights framework, but also be a champion and an ally for the rest of the world.
Thank you so much, Alberto. So we're not going to throw the human rights framework out with the bathwater.
No.
We're going to keep plugging away
Yes.
and bring more allies on board. And Maria, Representative Titus mentions that there have been many positive developments for LGBTIQ people, many of which were proposed in her GLOBE Act, which has not passed, gotten through Congress, but which the Biden administration implemented unilaterally as executive policy. So can you say a little bit about what some of the ways are that LGBTIQ people concretely gained from policies under the Biden administration? And what are you most concerned about losing? And what should we do about it? That's a long question, Tamsin. 3 minutes.
I mean, I think for me, the key is that it has been, LGBTIQ rights has been a foreign policy priority for the Biden administration. And so I don't look at it as much as like the individual policy gains, but the fact that the US has been able to play a leadership role on these issues has had, I think, a big impact. And that is important both in terms of using both the multilateral system, but also the bilateral relationships that the US has. For example, the adoption of a resolution at the UN General Assembly about elections, having that resolution be inclusive and specifically mention sexual orientation and gender identity, it is a step forward. It's not only about the U.S. saying this, but like bringing other states along. And so losing that leadership, I think, is going to be, it's going to be felt. And I think we see it also in terms of pushing back against the backlash that we see in so many different countries, having the US and other states play a role there in the bilateral discussions. But I mean, it's a fact, the US is represented in more countries. They have more embassies, and they obviously, as we all know, and I can say this, I mean, being from Sweden, the US has obviously an outsized influence on the rest of the world. So states are more interested and more likely to pay attention when the U.S. says something than when many other states do that. So I actually think that the sort of the soft power is the most significant piece, and that will be most felt under a different administration. And also, of course, I mean, the U.S. has stepped up gradually over a long period of time to fund more when it comes to global LGBTIQ issues. And that's also important because we've heard a few people comment on that in the previous panels today, but the global movement does not have a lot of resources. And so any kind of resources, especially coming from the US government, has been really important. I think there's a lot of unknown around what that's going to look like going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So definitely facing a loss of some of that soft power influence, potentially losing some really good language in multilateral spaces, and potentially losing a lot of funding. So this sounds like a lot of things to worry about and keep us up at night. I'm going to turn back to Alberto again for a moment. And also keeping in mind, whenever I talk to Alberto or my other colleagues from Latin America, Eastern Europe, and of course, Sub-Saharan Africa and many other parts of the world, I'm reminded that people have gotten through difficult administrations, governments that are based in anti-rights and anti-gender logic in the past. And we can too get through this. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Alberto, was that at the very end of her video, Representative Titus makes the point that that the best way to preserve global LGBTIQ gains is to lean into defending democracy. And I'm interested in that, and I wish that she were here so that we could, nudge her a little bit more on that. Because interestingly, we did have a democratic election in the U.S., relatively speaking, and there are losses for our community as a result of that democratic election. Again, that's not to say that we throw out democracy. But do you think that it is the case that defending democracy around the world and prioritizing that, and perhaps working in solidarity with other movements outside of the silo of the LGBTIQ movement, working in broader democratic spaces, might be one of the paths forward over the next few years?
Sure, but I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that democracy is not only the elections, the day that people go to vote. Democracy is also strong institutions. So, for example, when I think about progress in the LGBTQ rights movement in my region, in Latin America, you can see the importance of strong institutions. And I'm going to use marriage equality as an example. You have two paths for marriage equality there. One is Congress, and you can see that democracies that have strong political parties, strong social movements, are the ones that gain marriage equality through Congress. And also there are other countries where that was not possible through Congress, but they have a strong judiciary system. And they got, through historical rulings, this sort of legislation. So in the first case, I'm thinking about Uruguay, Chile, I'm thinking about also Argentina. In the second case, in the case of the courts, I'm thinking about Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador. So it's not a coincidence, like countries with weak institutions like Peru or Venezuela or Paraguay or a lot of countries in Central America are the ones that are lacking of marriage equality and other important pieces of legislation. It's because we have weak institutions, that they don't have the independence and the sort of power they need to move forward in agendas that sometimes are not quite popular in the region. So for me, it makes a lot of sense of thinking about fighting for democracy here, fighting for democracy in other countries where we feel like the anti-democratic groups are being stronger and stronger. And of course, for us to be able to do that, we need to think about the democratic agenda as a whole, not only the LGBTIQ component. And I'm going to use an example. Right now, in different countries around the world, I'm thinking about Georgia, I'm thinking about Paraguay, I'm thinking about Peru. There's a strong push in Congress to legislate against NGOs, to have strong regulations so you can suffocate NGOs. And when you think, and when you see why do they want to move forward, these are NGOs that work on LGBTIQ issues, sure, but also on freedom of press, also protecting the environment, and other parts of the agenda around human rights. So it's important that if we are all being attacked by the same groups, then that we all work together because we are defending the same principles and concepts.
Thank you so much, Alberto. And I think two really critical points that you mentioned there that I'm also going to kind of segue into my question to Maria about my last question. So strong institutions, one of the things that many of us who analyzed Project 2025 put out by the Heritage Foundation that was very clear is that Project 2025 is actually seeking to weaken institutions other than the executive. So there's a blueprint that they have put in place for weakening institutions, weakening government, and strengthening power in the hands of a few. So I think you're absolutely right that that's something we have to push back against. And I also think this question of attacking NGOs is something that we see coming down the line in the US right now as well. And in fact, Maria and I were in Congress the other day with a few of our colleagues trying to speak to some legislators about legislation in the US that does precisely that makes it possible for the Trump administration to kind of unilaterally suspend the work of nonprofits. This is really concerning, and this is something that we need to have our eye on. So Maria, in the last minute and a half that we have of the panel, as we do see from Representative Titus's speech, we do have strong allies in the US Congress. We're not in the majority, but we are close in the House. And we also presume that we will have other allies sprinkled throughout the US government in different places. Some of you are in this room today. We wish you courage as you go into the next administration. How can we take advantage of those allies that we do still have within the US government?
I mean, I think that when you work on, LGBTIQ issues in some ways, of course, it's like, for politicians, we see this when we work with diplomats and other people in government. It's like they don't necessarily, we are the ones who are following this on a day-to-day basis, and we're in the nitty-gritty. And I think some of what you just mentioned about some of the bills that have been proposed, they come in seemingly around being anti-terrorist, or there are bills that are being proposed about transparency, like all of the things that generally everyone would agree on, but it's only when you really read it and analyze it and you see, okay, this could be used in a very damaging way. And so I think that speaking to our allies, but also, I don't think we can't just speak to the people that we know and we have identified as being our allies. We need to speak to other people as well, and try to find some of that common ground and try to make some of these arguments why it's damaging for a whole range of reasons to push forward some of these bills. I think that's what we're going to have to do. And yeah, of course it's going to be tough, but honestly, I don't know, I've been doing this kind of work for 25 years, and it's kind of always tough. And even when you have a lot of allies, even when you feel like, okay, we're actually able to move forward. I mean, honestly, when you sit in civil society, you're always asking for more, and you never think that enough is being done. And so for me personally, I think I'm going to lean into that, lean into the fact that, yeah, it's always hard but it's always important, and it's going to be just as important. We're going to have to keep going. And the fact that we have a lot of allies, we have our own communities to rely on. So that's how I look at the next several years.
Thank you so much, Maria. And as one of the earlier speakers was saying, and unfortunately I'm forgetting who it is, if you put all of us together who are marginalized in one way or another, and we all put our voices together, we are much stronger than the minority that's trying to preserve control for itself. So thank you both. I think we have some guidelines as to how Outright is going to move forward. We're going to stick with our allies that we have and look for allies in new places. We're going to hold our ground. We're going to lean into human rights, democracy, rule of law, and insist that our movement is not going back. So thank you both for that short discussion, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are going to invite our next panel to come to the stage.